artificial intelligence will completely transform our world. But what is AI? Why will it affect you? And how can you and your business survive and thrive through the AI revolution? Welcome to AI and You. Here is your host, author, speaker, and futurist, Peter Scott.
Hello, welcome to episode 229. Digital Humanities. Sounds like a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? The intersection of our digital, technology-centric culture and the humanities like arts, literature, and philosophy. Like, are you sure there's anything even there? Aren't we talking about oil and water here? Well, no. Digital humanities is a really important discipline because it illuminates both of these divergent fields from fresh viewpoints. And my guest today is Professor Caroline Bassett, the first director of Cambridge Digital Humanities, an interdisciplinary research center in Cambridge University. She is a fellow of Corpus Christi College and researches digital technologies and culture change with a focus on AI. She co-founded the Sussex Humanities Lab, and at Cambridge, she inaugurated the Masters of Philosophy in Digital Humanities, and last month launched the new doctoral program in Digital Humanities. Now, we're going to reference C.P. Snow and his two cultures in this episode, and to explain that, C.P. Snow was a scientist and novelist, and in 1959, he gave a landmark lecture, at Cambridge no less, that was a sort of cultural equivalent of Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, bemoaning how science and the humanities were becoming increasingly estranged. This part of the lecture is too good not to quote here, where he's describing groups of people from the arts. A good many times, I have been present at gatherings of people who, by the standards of the traditional culture, I thought highly educated, and who have with considerable gusto been expressing their incredulity at the illiteracy of scientists. Once or twice, I have been provoked and have asked the company how many of them could describe the second law of thermodynamics. The response was cold. It was also negative. Yet I was asking something which is the scientific equivalent of, have you read a work of Shakespeare's? I now believe that if I had asked an even simpler question, such as, what do you mean by mass or acceleration, which is the scientific equivalent of saying, can you read, not more than 1 in 10 of the highly educated would have felt that I was speaking the same language. So the great edifice of modern physics goes up, and the majority of the cleverest people in the Western world have about as much insight into it as their Neolithic ancestors would have had. End quote. So Caroline and I are going to talk about what digital humanities is, how it intersects with AI, what science and the humanities have to learn from each other, technocratic rationality, Joseph Weizenbaum and the reactions to his ELIZA chatbot, Luddites, and how passively or otherwise we accept new technology. Let's get into the interview. Caroline Bassett, welcome to AI and You. It's fascinating to learn about the Cambridge Digital Humanities, and that's a field that you have been in for some time now. Perhaps you could just start us out by saying how you got into that field and what it means to you.
I think digital humanities is probably a field that changes as technology changes and as culture changes. So, like many other people, I got into digital humanities slightly accidentally, but now it looks like a really brilliantly designed trajectory. So I started out with an English degree. I became a tech journalist for a number of years. And then I went back to Sussex University because I was interested in digital shifts and cultural change, did a doctorate there, and worked in a school of media, film and music for many years, looking at some of those issues, particularly in relation to issues including gender and technology, cultural change and social justice. But I was always interested also in digital methods. So when the chance came up at Cambridge to start a centre or to develop a centre here, really, I jumped.
And you said something there that I don't want to take for granted. You said, now looks brilliant. Why?
I think because one of the ways that people tend to think about digital humanities, or DH, we may as well call it, is that it has a very laid out field formation, if you like. So it began with some people in libraries digitizing some stuff. and thinking about some methods. But I think it's much, much broader. And I think there are many routes into this field of study and into research, into AI and technology and culture. And so mine involved engaging with literature and culture, engaging with questions of technology quite closely. I became quite tech literate when I was a tech journalist. And then going back through media studies and digital media studies, which is interested in questions of mediation and questions of technologization, and then coming back to digital humanities. So now it looks very intentional. But like many other people really who cross fields, some of it was about chance and serendipity. If I hadn't won the funding for the Sussex Humanities Lab with some really brilliant collaborators, I don't think I would have got the chance to build CDH, Cambridge Digital Humanities. So, there's chances, aren't there, really?
Is there something about the way the world is evolving at the moment that makes the star of digital humanities rising particularly fast?
Yeah, and that's probably AI. But also, one of the things I'm concerned to think about is how we understand what's happening at this moment of technological change and how we relate it to earlier moments. So if you've been around a bit, you can remember internet hype and the way that everybody said the internet will change the world. And before that, that claim has been made for many, many technological shifts. So there's a way in which, and at particular moments, particular kinds of thinking, particular inquiries fit. So as cultures and societies have been forced to address questions about the collision between media technologies, computational technologies, and cultures, have been forced to address those questions simply because the changes are so great and the challenges are so great. And the scale and pace of those transformations is so rapid, so that this is a moment in which the questions that digital humanities wants to ask fit.
And what are those questions? What is it that you want to make sure we don't miss out on?
I think we have to ask about the stakes of what we're doing by automating culture. What are the stakes of this major transformation of how we think, how we live, how we calculate, how we organize, how we act even? What are the stakes of those changes? And also, how do we think about our own agency within them? And who's the we in that sentence? Who are we who are claiming to control this or think we don't control it? Are we people in Cambridge? People in Britain? Are we people in Silicon Valley? Are we Musk? What are the stakes of those transformations for whom? And actually, I think one of the reasons that digital humanities is growing at the moment is that with NLPs, with AI developments, particularly around language, the questions that seem to be very computational are very obviously very cultural.
Say more about that. What obviously computational questions?
Well, I think computer science has assumed for many decades, really, that the humanities in particular hasn't got much to offer the sciences and hasn't got much to offer computer science as it develops this stuff, internet stuff, network stuff, sensors. But AI, and particularly NLPs, natural language processing, they bring what computers are doing very close to things the humanities have been interested in for decades. What language is, what creativity is, what constitutes meaning in writing. So the questions that the humanities can ask are suddenly questions computer science also needs to ask. So there's this interconnection. It's not yet a successful interconnection, actually. There's lots of ways in which many disciplines are passing each other like ships in the night, talking around concepts that sound as though they're the same, but they're different. But nonetheless, if you want to ask yourself what is happening to language when huge amounts of it is being generated by chatbots, then that's a question that the humanities are interested in, that literature might talk to, that literary studies has investigated, that computer science is also asking. So there is this confluence.
I was struck by your question, who are we? Because it goes back to the Greeks and know thyself. And so that's a question that philosophy has tried to get us to ask ourselves for millennia. And people in STEM have tended to focus on how do we discover more about the physical world and build more cool stuff, while the philosophers are saying, don't forget us. Now, is this encroachment of technology into the sphere of humanities more and more through, as you say, language, giving you the opportunity to say, here are the questions about who we are that need to be asked before you can do more of this kind of development?
Well, one way to respond to that would be to say that whatever else the humanities can do, or maybe the social sciences can do at the moment, I don't think it directly stops Silicon Valley from doing what it's going to do. I mean, that's a problem. Mm-hmm. So I don't think the importance of the work that's done around DH or work that's done in the social sciences or the humanities around AI is directly impacting actually what gets made. It might be diffusing into debates around policy, around sovereignty, even culture, but I don't think it's directly impacting. And I've forgotten the first half of that question.
But that's what you're trying to do, right? At the center is have more of an impact on that world. In terms of, here we have the two worlds, C.P. Snow's two cultures, if you will, still famously separate. Do you see them as being equally able to learn from the other, or is there a particular direction that you are aiming to have more influence on?
I think they can both learn from each other. I think I would like to make a distinction between what computer science might learn from the humanities and what Silicon Valley, as currently instantiated, might be trying to learn from liberal universities. And that is a different question, I think, and it's quite important to make that distinction, because that's the distinction between what rigorous computer science is doing, if you like, and what Silicon Valley is doing to instrumentalize some of those forms of knowledge and with a particular kind of power. But I like to go back to this question about the we, who we are, because one of the things I think that digital humanities can do, and that CDH, which is our center, is really trying to think through, is to challenge this very convenient division that shows up in lots of AI thinking in the way that AI is described and discussed, which says there's the machine here and there's the human there. And the stakes of this thing is the human versus the machine. And I think that's the wrong place to start. And I think that that's very important, partly because to think about the machine is to reduce and to narrow ways of thinking through what AI is, and I'll come back to that. But it's also to assume that we humans have identical, universal, shared interests. And actually, that's not a good place to start. If you're thinking about the future of technology, for example, digital technology, maybe not AI technology even, then, as William Gibson said, the future might be here, but it's not evenly distributed. So it depends where you start from. And that is different for different groups of people, for different nations, for people with different economic capacities, different economic situations. So I think one of the things that's really important is to refuse to talk about we, the human, and therefore to refuse to talk about presumed universal benefits of AI or presumed universal evils of AI, really. I don't think that it's a useful way to think about AI to say it's good for humanity or bad for humanity. I think we need to say, for whom can this technology be generative or useful? For who can it benefit and in what way? And the humanities has been thinking about these presumptions about a universality that doesn't pertain for many decades, and it's very important to do that. And technology and gender studies would help you to think that. And the other side of that question is to also refuse this machine-human division, because actually humans are technosocial and machines, AI, is thoroughly infused with human culture. So I think starting from there produces a different way of thinking about AI. And I would start with pretty much with some sense of co-evolution. We evolve with technology to become who we are, and technology evolves with us to become what it is. And that evolution isn't even, and it isn't evenly distributed, and it doesn't provide universal benefits or even universal evils, to put it like that.
And it is making me think in other directions, one of which is that a machine or anything else has no existence in the world, and this is a philosophical stance here, other than what we give it, other than what we ascribe to it. And I think that's something that's missed largely by Silicon Valley, that's looking at the world from this physics viewpoint, but that nothing exists in the world with any meaning other than how we view it, how we use it, how we interact with it. Without any of that, it might as well not be there. And so in that sense, there is no machine without the human. Is that another way of phrasing where you were going?
I think there can be no machine without the human, but that once there is a machine, which we can accept as a techno-social machine, which we, in the case of AI, we know it's learned on large language models, which based on human discourse. I think once it's in the world, it may not mean, but it does act. I think it's quite possible to refuse to deal in AGI fantasies or speculative fantasies of consciousness, but still to realize that you absolutely need to think through questions of AI machine agency. And actually, AI agency might be a different kind of agency from earlier technologies, but we can think about technologies as agents in many different ways. And you can think about the agency of technology and the way in which it encodes social laws or operates in relation to many, many earlier technologies. The difference with AI is this capacity to be generative, to learn from itself, if you like, and to its opacity, I suppose.
I want to go back to something you said earlier about the way that AI now is, not your word, but consuming, in a sense, the humanities world, swallowing literature in one obvious sense. And the takeaway I had from that was something that reflects a quote of yours from something you wrote about ELIZA, which is going back a long way now, of course. We'll talk more about that. But quote, "This world which is itself poisoned by technocratic rationality." And I wanted to ask you to expand on that, what you meant by that. But it's also the quote that came to my mind when you were talking about the way that AI is moving into humanities, starting with the way it's consuming our words. What is that relationship?
I mean, there's different ways to pull that apart. And Weizenbaum is going back a long way, although I think that what Joseph Weizenbaum did with ELIZA, the chatbot he produced, and his response to it is very interesting as a precursor to debates recurring now. And part of what's interesting about Weizenbaum was that he wrote a chatbot and then spent the rest of his career as an apostate in the temple of technology trying to undo what he had produced, although he never stopped working as a computer scientist. But one of the things I find interesting about that was that his dismay, if you like, at what he'd produced was really not so much about what ELIZA could do, because he said ELIZA couldn't do much, but it was about the way in which ELIZA, as a chatbot that really was rather pathetic, was taken seriously as a machine that could take over human functions, including human-to-human functions, very well. So his real dismay was that ELIZA was taken seriously by therapists as something that could condition or cure the human mind, if you like. I think that is very interesting as a way of thinking about contemporary anxiety and concern around AI and how far it reaches into areas that we have previously assumed to be human and not formalizable. And that brings me back to a response about why is there this fear of AI and a kind of incursion? And I think it's because computational to undertake AI, or what AI does, or what LLMs do, large language models and natural language processing do, they have to formalize natural language. And formalization is inevitably a kind of reduction. And so the claim then would be that that which was open-ended and vibrant and perhaps vital becomes that which is dead and computable. And that in that moment, there's a reduction of human culture to a form of machine sterility, to put it like that. I mean, that's the fear. I'm not sure it really works like that, because I don't think that AI really operates in isolation from human practices. The question is how long the chain is, if you like.
Well, it makes me think about reduction like reducing poetry to diagramming sentences. And the original symbolic AI approach of we should be able to understand all language by semantic analysis, and that didn't get far enough. Now we pass it through some sort of magical layer that is able to do things with it, but not explain it in a way that would satisfy those original symbolic analysts. I want to come back to this vibrant phrase, world poisoned by technocratic rationality, because it reminds me of part of my last book that I wrote, where I started by introducing Victorian eccentrics, you know, the sort of people who built follies in the garden and were just famously dotty, did things for no logical reason whatsoever, but were quite harmless, and extended the world of our awareness in directions that simply wouldn't have gone if we had been trying to go from A, B, C.
A to B.
Yes, they were just off on a different alphabet. So is that where you were going, that the way that AI in particular is approaching language in particular, but just as an example, is reducing it to some sort of linguistic game? I don't want to put words in your mouth here, but these are the words it makes me think about.
I'm not sure that I think it's reducing it to a linguistic game. I don't want to go there, but I think it is interesting to think about the strains, to think about some of the work currently being done, looking at earlier discussions around early AI and semantic processing, and pioneers here at Cambridge, including people like Margaret Masterman, that were always thinking in a more Wittgensteinian way about the breadth and clusters of words. But we should set that aside, although it's extremely interesting. So the term technocratic rationality is a way of thinking and engaging with the world, which might lead us back towards writers, including people like Adorno from the Frankfurt School, right back after the Second World War, around that time. So you have these refugees from Europe who land up in the States, and they've escaped Nazism and the bureaucratic forms of fascism. They get to the States and they're horrified by mass culture, by mass media and mass culture. And they talk about the way in which television and radio and films have, if you like, encoded the world and formalized it and emptied it out. So they talk about a kind of technocratic form of rationality, a way of knowing and being that is machinic, if you like. And why that's interesting in relation to AI is that you could see the formalization of language as a massive extension of that kind of program of technocratic rationality, ways in which that which is alive, that which is human, that which is amenable to fuzziness, if you like, is encoded into a world in which actions, thinking, words are computable. And that is thoroughly inhuman, if you like, and also amenable, or makes us amenable to forms of social control that were not possible before. So the classic way to think about that is to think about dividuation. So think about a social media platform, think about ways in which each action, each like, each push is captured and fed back to you, so that you're cybernetically, if you like, encased in a system which is really exploiting you and exploiting your desires, and not simply the desires you have, but shaping your future thinking, if you like. That's the fear of technocratic rationality. And I don't think we're in it. I haven't got an absolutist view of where we are. I don't think AI is going to produce that kind of system on its own. The fear is what people do with it, which is why I would say AI is neither good nor evil. I think it's not ontologically good or evil technology for that reason.
And that evokes something you wrote recently where you said AI will bring in new cultural patterns and forms, generate new possibilities for how we work and study. And then you went on to say what you just did, that but what we do with those depends on us. It's not about whether AI is good or evil. So there's the argument that AI is a thing and what matters is what we do with it. What are the possibilities that you see there that you talked about in the first part of that, the new cultural patterns and forms? That sounds positive.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is that I should really have added time to that, because I don't think that AI is neither good nor evil and it depends what we do with it. That's not to say that what the patterns we have laid down, the forms of technological culture we have instantiated are not durable and difficult to change and embedded and powerful, so that we can't wake up in the morning and say, oh, we didn't like what social media did to us, let's not have it. We're 10 years into a form of everyday life that relies on it, that is embedded in our political economies and our societies. So we can't simply renounce it. It's not simple. So to say technology is neither good nor evil is not to say that it doesn't carry powerful legacies and that those encodings, if you like, or tendencies or affordances, the affordances we build into technologies are not simply turnable, onable, and offable with a switch. You can't simply turn them on and off.
But the fact that we can't turn off social media, for instance, shouldn't mean that we don't then look at, document, study, and publicize the negative effects that it's had.
That's right. Because we might not be able to turn it off, but we can think about ways in which the technological cultures that are being built are built differently over time. You know, there's ways to build different technology. The technology we have doesn't have to be the technology that the market gave us. That's more or less a quote from Matt Fuller, and I agree with him. I think it's important to make a distinction between what technology is and does and what technology as it's shaped and instantiated by markets, if you like, by capitalism, what that is. And I don't think those things intersect in powerful ways, but they're not terminal. You might say that using the internet is compulsory these days. There's no other way to go. On the other hand, so was maths at school, and I used to skid out of it. I think compulsory, the idea of a technology as compulsory, is very interesting, inescapable, but yet there's always the notion that something is compulsory can also point to ways in which it might be tested or resisted or thought differently.
Right. And that sort of hints that that whole axis of engagement with the world, where you could at one end of that go off and live in a cave, but this is not something that's realistic for most people, and neither is disengaging from things like utilities or in some way living off the grid. It starts to become more feasible and people do that. But for a great many people, that is just not available. And so we've got to look at, I mean, for many people, disengaging from even social media is not possible. It can be part of their job.
In Britain, if you need to claim social security benefits, if you need to register as unemployed, if you want to use the health service, you probably need a smartphone.
Right.
So the systems that we have built with technology have become pervasive and there's nothing else behind them. You know, you have to ask what happens to somebody who was collecting money in the street when there's only cashless societies. So those questions really matter. And I think you're right that questions then about absolute technological rejections don't make much sense. I wrote a whole book about anti-computing, which really interested me. And at the beginning, I was really searching for people who were absolutely abjuring technology, who were really not using any kind of computational media. And there's very few, and it's almost impossible. And it seems to me that we are technological beings.
And I read the anti-computing book, and I made a note at one point, Luddite, ? And then I thought by the end of this, I wonder whether you would identify perhaps as Luddite adjacent.
I'm not sure that I would identify as Luddite adjacent, because I think the Luddites are traduced because they're assumed to be mindless machine breakers, whereas in fact they were responding to a set of initiatives by their employers to use machines to change their conditions of working. So there was actually a political protest there. And I think to assume the way that Luddism is invoked today in relation to computational technology or AI as simply, we don't want it mindlessly, it doesn't really help. But taking your point about Luddite adjacency, I've spent a lot of time being engaged with computational technologies and also enchanted by them and interested in them, and could not possibly write an academic paper without a laptop, and would not wish to, and really like being able to get around cities and use a map. And also think in a maybe more collective way that it is extremely useful to have public transport systems that are enabled by AI operations. So I'm not against AI, and I think there are ways that it is incredibly interesting and that there are generative possibilities for AI, with AI, using AI, and that automation itself is really, really interesting to think through. How to think it through responsibly, or to think what responsibility should be, is something the humanities is also thinking about. And it's a very familiar discourse now, but to ask, what does the cloud cost? I think we've got over the idea that the cloud is virtual and cost-free and extremely green and light and air. And I think whoever we are again, I think there's a wide understanding that computational models, and AI in particular, is ecologically expensive, environmentally destructive, and that we need to think about these things and factor them in. So I think the point really is to think responsibly about the costs of this stuff and to ask those questions. But somewhat separately from that, I'm just extremely intrigued. I am intrigued by AI's capacities to make language and its capacity to generate new kinds of image, and the surprisingness of what it does, and the peculiar sense that we're dealing with a tool that's become an agent. And once again, I'm not talking about an agent that is conscious. And so I do think there's ways in which living with AI is going to be really, really interesting.
So I would agree with your assessment of the Luddites. I think they're perhaps a victim of the Victor writes the history phenomenon, that they were, in fact, more thoughtful. But I want to connect this back with Weizenbaum and ELIZA. That's a topic that I spent no small amount of time researching. I tried mightily to discover the identity of the secretary who asked him to leave the room while she conversed with it, and only got as close as it's probably this person, but it wasn't good enough. And so I've looked at that in unusual amount of depth, including reading the source code, which is not that long. So you point out that there's this whole other dimension to ELIZA, which is Weizenbaum's reaction to it as a social phenomenon, and perhaps as a sentinel, a precursor of today's much greater, more sophisticated digital humanities advocacy, if you will. Can you expand upon what you saw in Weizenbaum's reaction?
I think Weizenbaum's reaction was interesting, partly because it was a response to not only to what computers could do or what nascent AI could do, but also because he began to understand that a certain way of thinking beyond computer science was intersecting with computer science to produce forms of human interaction and human control he didn't like. So one of the reasons ELIZA is so interesting, or Weizenbaum's response to ELIZA is so interesting, is that he understood it to be part of a broader cultural formation. So he sees what computer science is doing to formalize human language as a part of other scientific attempts to formalize and understand human behavior, particularly Skinner behaviorism and human conditioning. And if you think about ELIZA as a dialogue, as a chat dialogue, and how it worked, and then you think about for example, Skinner and the rats in a cage responding to stimulant, so conditioning stimulant response, then he saw these connections and he understood them to be about, if you like, something close to an iron cage of rationality, a dividing up and a chunking and an extension of control over human behavior. So he was dismayed by what he saw as the incursion by machines into human individual freedom, human individual subjectivity, the self. He saw it as an attack on the self, really. And Hannah Arendt, writing not that far away, also worried about automation and even computers and automation as producing a society that's dazed and functionalist rather than still free, to put it like that. So this idea that technology is encroaching on freedom and that freedom is something about the subject, that human subjectivity is being constrained, and that ELIZA was an example of that. That's what animated Weizenbaum.
There's a lot more layers in that than I was previously aware of. I saw Weizenbaum reacting to people thinking that this was a therapist, or, I mean, they were smart enough to know that it wasn't, that it was a computer, but they still used it like a therapist and said, this is useful to me. And I think he was, what looked like to me that he was saying, I don't like the fact that people are confusing this thing for a therapist or heading in that direction. I'm going to turn it off. That's not what it is supposed to be. It was an exercise in string processing, strings of text.
Yeah, it's a slip.
And to me, that's always seemed as though we were investing it with much more agency than it deserved, or that he was doing that, because people get therapeutic value from things that have no computation in them whatsoever. Tarot, I Ching, tea leaves. If they
literature.
If they're looking at those things with the viewpoint of this is going to give me an insight into my life, they will find it in anything, in a bird flying off a tree. And so is there something fundamentally different in them engaging with something as simple as ELIZA and getting that kind of benefit? Or is the fact that it presents itself with the language of a human therapist something that changes that equation?
I think he was horrified that such a bad adequation of a human as ELIZA, or simply through the bad and obviously transparently bad and inadequate approximation of a human voice, he was worried that that appeared to be enough. I think that's what he was really worried about. So that I don't think Weizenbaum could possibly have thought that people were confused by ELIZA. It's more that they chose to believe that the conversation with ELIZA was worth something.
Is it like a suspension of disbelief for the purpose of this conversation? I am going to
Yes, and
pretend.
Sherry Turkle, I'm sure you've followed this, but 60s to 90s. So in the early years of the internet, Sherry Turkle went back and talked to a bunch of computer students at MIT about bots and about ELIZA, actually. And the students said they were absolutely aware that ELIZA was an artificial being or was simply a script. I mean, probably was not an artificial being, was simply a script, but they liked it. And one reason they liked it was that they quite liked talking to things that weren't humans.
Well, and also that it's not judging them.
Yeah, there's no judgment. I mean, Weizenbaum is clear somewhere in Computers and Human Reason, in the book that he wrote, that he somehow felt that computer science was at the forefront of a whole series of shifts that meant that culture was ready for ELIZA, and that's why ELIZA was a hit. And he has a sense that that's to do with an acceptance of a particular way of thinking about what it means to be human, which is already somewhat more interested in controlling humans than it is in human freedom.
And who's doing the controlling?
I'm not sure what he would say. In fact, I would say he's very confused about that. But he can see that computation might contribute to a society of control, to put it like that.
And if we bring this up to date with contributions like The Social Dilemma, then there's an obvious sense of control. I mean, the I think it was vice president of Facebook, said, our goal is to get you to spend as much time on the platform as possible because they can turn that into dollars. And that had effects in changing psychology of people en masse. That's the end of the first half of the interview. ELIZA was a landmark chatbot created in 1967 by Joseph Weizenbaum at MIT, which we've talked about more in a number of episodes, most recently number 197. In today's news, ripped from the headlines about AI, Waymo, the autonomous taxi service, now takes more than 100,000 paid rides per week, double the number from just May. This is in their markets in San Francisco, Phoenix, and Los Angeles, where over 150,000 people are on the wait list to ride. Despite being the leading robotaxi service, they're not yet profitable, and there are still occasional incidents, like when a cluster of Waymo cars in a parking lot decided to drive in circles and honk at each other all night. Next week, I'll conclude the interview with Caroline Bassett, when we'll talk about how technology shapes our psychology, how it enables mass movements, science fiction, the role of big Silicon Valley companies, and more of this seeing the world of AI through this unique lens that Caroline provides. That's next week on AI and You. Until then, remember, no matter how much computers learn how to do, it's how we come together as humans that matters.
That's all for this episode of AI and You. Please leave a rating and comment and share with your friends. Get the book Artificial Intelligence and You and see more videos and articles at aiandyou.net. That's aiandyou.net, where you can also send us your questions. Thank you for listening.